When the Chinese Civil War ended with victory for the Communist Party in 1949, the Kuomintang, the defeated Nationalist Party, did not give up. Not completely. The nationalist soldiers loaded ships and planes with gold, silver, fuel, ammunition, anything they felt they would need to establish a new government. And they sent it all to an island off the southeast coast of China, Taiwan. A lot of them imagined that Taiwan was just a temporary stop, because this man, the Nationalist Party's leader Chiang Kai-shek, vowed to defeat the Communist Party and take China back in 5 years. The Nationalist Party formed a military dictatorship that ruled Taiwan for 4 decades. Today, almost 80 years later, a war might be brewing. Taiwan's democracy ended the dictatorship of Chiang Kai-shek's Nationalist Party, and the island evolved into an economic powerhouse. And in 2024, the Taiwanese people elected a government generally viewed as pro-independence for the 3rd time in a row. Growing support for Taiwanese self-determination has put the island on a collision course with Beijing, which insists that Taiwan is a part of China. The majority of countries in the world, including the US, view Beijing as the sole government of China, and Chinese officials have threatened that any move Taiwan takes toward independence will be met with force. For decades, China and Taiwan have both been preparing for the possibility of war. Taiwan's defense budget just reached a record high in 2024, and since the early 90s, China's defense spending has exploded by almost 900%. And satellite analysis shows China has upgraded its air bases on the southeastern coast facing Taiwan. For half a century, the US has recognized the PRC as the sole government of China, but is purposefully ambiguous about whether it views Taiwan as a part of China. But President Biden has said that the US would defend Taiwan in the case of China's invasion.
Are you willing to get involved militarily to defend Taiwan if it comes to that?
Yes.
You are?
That's the commitment we made.
In 2023, for the first time, the US approved military aid to Taiwan, through a program that's typically reserved for sovereign nations. But how did Taiwan come to be a sore point for the United States and China? And what do the Taiwanese really want? Okay, first let's get the basics out the way. China, officially named the People's Republic of China, is currently recognized by the UN and most countries in the world. Taiwan, officially named the Republic of China, is only recognized by 12 countries and does not have a seat at the UN. And here's where it starts to get complicated. The Chinese government says there is only one sovereign nation under the name China, meaning that Taiwan is a part of China, and the Chinese Communist Party is the government of that China. But the elected government in Taiwan insists that Taiwan is already its own country.
事实上已经是一个主权独立的国家，不必另行宣布独立。
To get to the root of this problem, we have to go back in time to 1912, when imperial rule ended in China and a new government called the Republic of China, or ROC, was founded. The Nationalist Party became the ruling government of China while also fighting the Communist Party in a civil war. After 9 years of fighting, the two parties paused the conflict to fight against Imperial Japan when it invaded and occupied the country in 1937. The Second Sino-Japanese War was particularly deadly.
For the Chinese, there is no escape. As the millions of China resist the might of Japan, thousands must suffer in a war for which they are not responsible.
Some estimates say that Japanese soldiers raped tens of thousands of women and killed hundreds of thousands of unarmed civilians in China's then capital, Nanjing. The conflict is part of what China's government calls its century of humiliation, referring to the nearly 100 years of military defeats when China had to cede territories to foreign powers like Japan, France, and Britain. Taiwan was one of the territories ceded to Japan by Imperial China. After Japan surrendered at the end of World War II, Taiwan was returned to the ROC. When the Communist Party tells its own history, the return of these Chinese territories, including Taiwan, serves as a symbol of victory in its fight against imperialism.
1945年，中国人民同世界各国人民一道，取得了中国人民抗日战争及世界反法西斯战争的伟大胜利。
I think war just begets more war, and I think with nationalism, oftentimes you just have past historical tragedies used to justify future military action.
Brian Hugh is a journalist and writer and a founder of New Bloom, an online magazine that focuses on Taiwanese politics and youth.
And with regards to these contemporary claims from China over Taiwan, that could lead to further tragedies, further warfare, and that's also in the name of nation and territory and land and national glory in that sense.
After Japan pulled out of China in 1945, the struggle for power between the Communist Party and the Nationalist Party resumed.
210,000 communists are dead or wounded in the battle, while some of the 50,000 nationalist wounded are evacuated by air to rear areas. Despite the horde of communist captives taken, the city falls to the Reds.
The rest is history. The Communist Party's victory in the Civil War resulted in the birth of the People's Republic of China, or PRC, and the Nationalist Party moved its government to Taiwan. But that is far from explaining why mainland China is recognized by most countries today and still wants to claim Taiwan. For the next few decades, the PRC and ROC were ruled separately across the Taiwan Strait under authoritarian dictatorships. Mao Zedong led mainland China from Beijing until his death. On the island off China's southeastern coast, Chiang Kai-shek imposed 38 years of martial law in Taiwan, despite local resistance. That period became known as the White Terror. Those who didn't support a total war with the PRC were labelled and persecuted as communist sympathisers. Tens of thousands of people were arrested for holding different political views from the government, and at least 1,200 were executed. For 2 decades, the two governments exchanged fire across the Taiwan Strait. The Nationalist Party wanted to retake China, and the Communist Party wanted to squash the ROC's leadership. Neither succeeded, and they both claimed to be the sole government of China. But what did other countries think? The ROC, led by the Nationalist Party, governing both the mainland and Taiwan, was a founding member of the UN in 1945. After the Nationalists fled to Taiwan, the UN continued to only recognize the ROC, even though it just controlled Taiwan. After the PRC's founding, other Soviet-aligned countries quickly recognized it as the government of China. Later, more and more countries joined them. In 1971, most UN members voted to expel the ROC and instead approved the PRC to represent China. Let's take a pause and zoom in here, because the 70s were an important decade for China and Taiwan. When the PRC joined the UN, the US still had not recognized it. In fact, the US has played a big part in the tug of war between China and Taiwan.
Taiwan has historically played a role for the US in terms of regional containment policy.
When Japan withdrew at the end of World War II, the Communist Party gained control of northern China, which had partly been held by the Soviet Union, and the US sent troops to make sure the Nationalist Party maintained control of southern China, including Taiwan. After the defeated nationalists fled to the island, again, the US sided with them.
I think particularly the US historically backed Taiwan in the interests of anti-communism and propped up a right-wing dictatorship here.
During the Vietnam War and the Cold War, Nationalist Party-led Taiwan provided regional and non-combat military support to the US. American backing was crucial to the Nationalist Party's military and political ambition. The ROC planned several military offensives on the mainland during the 60s, when Mao's China was suffering from famine and political turmoil. But the operations couldn't be carried out due to the lack of US support. Between 1949 and 1965, the US provided Taiwan with nearly $4 billion worth of military and economic aid. Before the PRC joined the UN in 1971, the US also deliberately delayed its membership from being approved. Then this happened.
My hope of the beginning that we have made on this journey, that many, many Americans, particularly the young Americans who like to travel so much, will have an opportunity to come here as I have come here today with Mrs. Nixon and the others in our party.
In 1972, a US president visited the PRC for the first time after its founding. This became a turning point in US-China relations. Entrenched in the Vietnam War and the Cold War, the American government saw an opportunity to finally form relations with the PRC and to isolate the Soviet Union when its rift with China was growing wider.
The United States recognizes the government of the People's Republic of China as a sole legal government of China.
In 1979, 30 years after the PRC's founding and 8 years after it joined the UN, the US officially recognized the PRC, but in classic US tradition, the American government was still trying to play both sides. It signed the Taiwan Relations Act, which legally mandates the US to provide arms for Taiwan to defend itself, and says that any attempt to use force against Taiwan would be of grave concern. But it doesn't say whether the US would go to war. What followed after the ROC lost both its UN seat and its official recognition from the US would change Taiwan's course completely. With the world embracing the PRC, China's then paramount leader Deng Xiaoping led economic reforms that made China a powerhouse in the US-dominated global capitalist system. Meanwhile, across the strait, in 1979, tens of thousands of activists and supporters gathered in Taiwan's second largest city, Kaohsiung, to demand press freedom and an end to one-party rule and martial law. Police beat protesters and injured over 100 people. Leaders of the protests were tried in military court and punished with harsh sentences, including life imprisonment. What is now known as the Formosa Incident kick-started the democratic movement in Taiwan. Under public pressure, the government started allowing non-nationalist party candidates to participate in national elections. Martial law started loosening and eventually ended in 1987. Since then, Taiwan has gone through numerous legislative and government reforms.
At the end of the day, there is this anxiety about distinguishing oneself from China. But then I think particularly in contemporary times, that is increasingly tied to that Taiwan is democracy and China is not. I think a lot of contemporary Taiwan's political identity is very pluralistic because there are all these diverse influences, whether from that the original Haps are indigenous, there's different waves of Han migration, that Taiwan went through the Japanese colonial period, and then the KMT period. And so I think that often leads to the framing that these are all different historical factors that some of which are quite tragic, contribute to the making of contemporary Taiwanese identity.
Today, the majority of people in Taiwan identify as primarily Taiwanese, some as both Taiwanese and Chinese, and only 3% as primarily Chinese. This shifting identity is reflected in the fact that the Democratic Progressive Party won an unprecedented third term in the presidential election in 2024. The party built its platform on supporting Taiwan's independence from China, while the Nationalist Party, which has long abandoned its dream of overtaking the mainland, is now seen as the party that favors closer ties with mainland China. The majority of people in Taiwan today want to maintain the current state of de facto but not formalized independence, though support for pursuing independence slowly has also increased over the past few decades. So why is China willing to go to war over Taiwan?
A lot of the nationalism that is used as a kind of rhetorical framing for it will frame Taiwan as lost to China because of colonialism, and then China needing to recover Taiwan because of this. And so then this plays back into this larger historical argument that contemporary China uses about itself to justify its rise.
Even though the Chinese government is unelected, a strong narrative like this could strengthen support for the Communist Party.
For centuries, powers have desired Taiwan because of its geopolitical location. If you do want to have power in the region, then Taiwan is something that you do need to have. In the present, particularly because of Taiwan's importance economically to the world, and because of its geopolitical location, I think China desires Taiwan as part of its rise.
And of course, enter the US again. It relies heavily on semiconductor factories in Taiwan, where most of the world's advanced computing microchips are made. Semiconductors power everything from iPhones to AI computing tools, to electric vehicles to fighter jets. In 2022, Biden banned sharing semiconductor technology with China to keep the US ahead both economically and militarily. Taiwan's position between China and the US has arguably become more crucial than ever.
And so I think a lot of the US framings regarding Taiwan go back to the Cold War. The present, I think particularly there's this concern about China and also concern about US power in the region. And one has seen this concern for some time. I mean, this TPP, for example, originally under Obama, was an attempt to cement the countries in the region together economically to counter China's rise. And I think Taiwan then also plays a role in the US's policy in the region. particularly concerning the island chains in the region.
Taiwan is in the center of a chain of islands the US considers critical to containing China, running from Japan to Taiwan to the Philippines, among other countries.
At the end of the day, Taiwan is held up as a way to stick it to China, but I think are still a sliver different. And so particularly the MAGA Republicans sometimes are, of course, very anti-China. But there's also been rhetoric lashing out at Taiwan. For example, Donald Trump, his comments about Taiwan taking semiconductor jobs from the US, that's about the same narrative he is using for China. That's stealing jobs, it's competing with the US in an unfair way.
Taiwan's status remains tangled in other countries' strategic priorities, this time framed by what many view as a new Cold War between the US and China.
Particularly, it does play into regional, not only regional, but global politics in terms of US power in this region, but also in the world. And I think, unfortunately, at present, Taiwan doesn't really have a way out of that. At the same time, I do think US power in the world is seeing a kind of crisis in which there's much more questions being raised about its reliability. And so Taiwan also needs to think of a path forward in that sense. I think at the end of the day, Taiwanese people kind of just hope to be left alone. And for example, nobody's rushing for a pro-independence referendum because this would provoke China into war. People don't want warfare. War helps nobody.